He went to the river to disappear, but a cry in the snow changed everything. Some men walk to the river meaning never to return, hearts frozen by what they've lost. But on a morning sharp with snow and wind, a thin cry in the white silence pulled him back from the edge. It wasn't just a child's voice, it was the last chance for a man who once failed to stay, to choose differently this time. Mason Hale went to the Powder River to let the cold bite the last of his thoughts away. The ice lay black where the current gnawed at its own skin, and the wind rushed the bend like a wolf. His boots punched through crusted snow. He walked without aim, a man rubbed thin by winter and memory. The sound reached him like a wire drawn tight, thin, high, and hurting. He stopped, head cocked, thinking it might be the river talking the way rivers do when a season turns. Then it came again, sharper, and he knew it for what it was. A cry, not coyote, not bird. He pushed through willow whips and dead grass frozen into combs. A frost-dusted elm stood just off the bank, and at its base sat a wicker basket. Snow powdered the weave. A corner of wool blanket lay stiff as bark. Mason went to his knees. His hands hovered, useless for a beat, then opened. Two small faces lay there, red as plums in the cold. One twin slept with her lips parted, the other fought the air, fists balled. Between the blankets was a slip of paper, ink washed into a tired river. He eased it free with a fingertip and read what he could. Please save them. Their names are Lily and Isa. Lord, he said, and his voice cracked like ice under a boot. He had not prayed since the night Eliza's fever took the heat out of his house and left the rooms ringing. But prayer wasn't a thing you said. It was a thing you did. He shrugged out of his coat and fed it to the twins, tucking them high against his chest. He knotted a scarf into a sling, slid the basket's blanket inside, and cinched them close so he could feel the wild flutter of their hearts. The wind punched the elm. Somewhere ice ticked like glass. He looked up and around. Snow, river, willow, sky, the color of iron. No footprints but his cutting across the white until he saw another mark near the brush, a smaller print, narrow-heeled, the toe long, a boy's boot by the shape of it. Fresh? Hard to say. The wind kept licking at the edges like a dog at a sore. Easy, he told the babies, because a man has to say something when the world tilts in his arms. He turned his back on the river. The first steps were blind and heavy, and then he found a rhythm the way a horse finds one on bad ground. The twins made a thin sawmill noise against his chest. The note he'd read had warmed and softened in his palm. He folded it and slid it into the pocket over his heart. The fence of his lower pasture lay to the east, half buried. He angled for it, using the posts like beads on a rosary, counting them off, breath by breath. Far off, a hammer knocked, echo maybe, or imagination. But he also knew the particular silence of being watched. By the time the rise to his yard showed, his arms had gone to fire and then to wood. The babies had quieted, and he could feel their warmth burning through the coat into his bones. The cabin roof crouched under snow, chimney a black finger. He crossed the yard slow, careful of ice, careful of everything. At the step he paused. The wind shifted and came at his back, quick and sudden, as if a room had gone still behind him. He turned his head, just enough to set the leather creaking in his collar. Nothing moved. No pony, no man, only the river, talking its cold talk, and the trees answering. But the hair along his neck stood anyway. He put his boot to the door. The latch gave. Mason Hale went inside with the winter at his heels, and two lives pressed close to his heart. The cabin took the first punch of wind and shut it out. Mason kicked the snow from his heels and shouldered the door closed. The room smelled of cold ashes and old coffee. He laid the twins on the bed, stripped his gloves, and built the fire like a man setting bones. Fast, sure, no wasted motion. Slats of pitch pine caught, popped, and went to flame. Heat moved across the room, slow as syrup, then quicker. He found the kettle by feel. The handle bit his palm with old iron chill. Water hissed over the grate. He hunted a clean spoon, settled for one he could wipe with his shirt. The basket's wool was stiff, the twins' feet colder than he liked. He rubbed them with his thumbs until color pushed up under the skin. Lily made a small bird sound. Asa fussed and flung a fist. On the high shelf sat the wooden cradle he hadn't touched since Eliza. Dust lay on it like gray snow. He pulled it down, and the dust turned to smoke in the firelight. He set it near the hearth and lined it with one of his winter shirts, soft where the elbows had thinned. He cut strips off another for diapers. Scissors weren't where he remembered. He used his knife and kept the blade away from shaking fingers. The kettle sang. He poured a little warm water into a tin cup and let a drop touch his wrist. Right heat. He wet the spoon and fed Lily, then Asa, one careful tilt at a time. Half of it ran crooked along their chins. He cupped the drips back with the bowl of his hand, muttering nothing words because a house needs the sound of a man talking to small things. The fire climbed. The room gave back a little life. He washed their feet with a rag and a memory. Eliza laughing at how stubborn a baby's toes could be. He set the rag aside and pulled the blankets close. The world shrank to two mouths working and a kettle breathing. The knock came like the tap of a measuring stick. 3 beats, even, not panicked, not friendly either. Mason turned the latch slow. Wind pushed a ribbon of snow in around the jamb. June Whitlow stood on the stoop with her scarf drawn high and her cheeks bright from the walk. Steam curled from 2 jars she had cradled in a folded towel. She didn't ask permission. She stepped in before the weather could. "Brought broth," she said, voice soft against the hiss of the fire. "And this." From the bag on her shoulder, she pulled a small cloth sack. Powder leaked along the seam and sugared the air. "Goat's milk powder, found it behind the kerosene. Folks keep forgetting I know where everything is." She set the jars by the hearth and looked past him to the cradle. Her breath lifted once, and that was all the surprise she allowed herself. "You warmed 'em good," she said. "I did what I could." "That's more than most would." She moved like she'd done it before, stoked the fire without being told, rinsed the spoon, measured powder with a neat pinch and level, added warm water, swirled the cup until it turned into something babies might believe in. She tested it on her wrist and nodded. "Not too hot," she said, handing it over. "They burn easy when they're new to the world." Mason fed Osa. The boy took to it like he'd been waiting his whole life. June watched, hands tucked into the crooks of her elbows, measuring him the way she measured flour. "Town's talking," she said after a time. "You haven't been in for weeks, but news runs faster than a Mustang with a burr under the saddle. Let it talk." Talking draws men like fresh blood draws flies. He didn't answer. He fed the last wet spoon to Lily, who made a small hum and drifted. The cradle creaked once and settled. June fished in her bag again and tossed him 2 folded squares of boiled flannel. "These breathe. Wash, boil, dry by the stove. Use the shirt for padding. Keep their ears covered if the wind shifts." He set the flannel by the bed and glanced at the window. Frost feathered the glass. The wind slid under the door and sniffed around the rugs. "They'll come asking," June said, eyes not leaving the fire. "Men with paper, men who wear the right coats for taking." "Let 'em ask." She studied him, then gave one of those small nods women give when the answer isn't good, but it's honest. "Then I'll help," she said, as if she were offering a cup of salt and not a piece of her life. He didn't thank her. He didn't have to. He took the cup, swirled it again, and fed Lily the last sweet mouthful. Silence came back with weight, the kind that makes a room seem smaller and safer. June wiped the spoon, boiled it in the kettle, then hung it by the handle from a nail to dry. She checked the firewood stack with a thumb and a glance, and made a list on the back of an old receipt. More flannel, camphor, cough syrup, if Reverend Harlan would part with his. A length of oilskin to stop that draft under the door. Mason laid the twins in the cradle side by side. They breathed the quick, shallow rhythm of fresh life. He dragged a chair close and sat with his hands over the heat, looking like a man thawing out something, older than fingers. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the folded note. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to read it again. "I won't walk away," he said, not much louder than the kettle, and June heard him anyway. She pulled the scarf up and went for the door. "I'll be back at first light," she said. "Tin pans on a string out by your woodpile would suit me fine. Trippers? Rattles? I want to hear who's coming before they get close enough to smell supper." He went to the window after she left. Snow was falling cleaner now, steady, intent. On the porch boards just beyond the sill where the drift thinned, a small boot print had taken a perfect bite out of the white. Narrow heel, long toe. The wind hadn't found it yet. Mason felt the hair lift along his arms. He stepped back, shut the curtain with 2 fingers, and set another log on the fire. The cradle creaked once. Lily sighed. Asa answered with a soft grunt, as if counting the room. "Easy," Mason told them. "We'll keep the heat up." Outside, the river ran under its own black lid. The wind turned again, quick as a man holding his breath. Dawn came pale and mean like a creditor. The stove breathed low. Mason counted the split logs left in the wood box, then stopped counting because numbers wouldn't change what was there. Lily ran warm to the touch. Asa squalled when the draft slid under the door. He set hot stones wrapped in damp cloth along the cradle board, the way Ayanna had told him to, then walked the room with Asa against his chest until the boy gave up a hiccuping sleep. June came early, snow climbing her boots, breath smoking. She set down a sack, flannel, camphor, liniment that smelled like a clean knife, and moved straight to Lily with the back of her hand. "We keep her wrapped, thin sips, ear caps if that wind shoulders in." Tin pans on a string clinked somewhere beyond the wall. Not wind. A small, quick jostle, then still. June slid her eyes to Mason and didn't say a word. He nodded. They let it happen again. Clink, clink. This time a hair faster, like someone learning a room by touch. Mason lifted the latch without sound. The porch held its breath. A drift stood like a white anvil along the edge. Across it ran a neat row of prints, narrow heel, long toe, half filled where the wind had tried and failed to erase. He stepped out one pace and caught a flick of a cap beyond the woodpile, a boy's ear-red face, eyes wide, a pencil tucked behind one. "Easy," Mason said, no more than a barn whisper. The boy bolted. June was already moving. She scooped a shovel into the drift and flung a sheet of powder sideways so it fell between the boy and the yard like a curtain. He vanished down the fence line, legs churning, hat flattened to his skull. "Ephraim Pike," June said, wiping the shovel clean with a gloved palm. "Writes for whoever pays him half a nickel and a lie. He'll grow out of it if someone shows him better, or he won't." Mason studied the fence, then the open ground beyond. No other shapes, no tall horses stamping, no shine of a neat brim, just the river's far-off murmur and the pins and needles hiss of the cold. They went back in. Lily had drifted, breath a fast, birdie beat. June measured powder, warm water, swirl, test. Mason fed Asa. The room told him he had time for a swallow of coffee gone slick at the top, and he took it without tasting anything but tired. The first note slid under the door, afternoon. A rectangle of thick paper edged with a tidy decal, wax seal pressed clean, a briar branch in a circle. June looked at Mason. Mason didn't look back. He bent, picked it up, and read it standing in the yellow square of the window. By order of the Territorial Board of Guardians, all foundlings are wards of the territory deliver, said wards to Ashbriar Home for foundlings, at once or face penalties in law. The rest was signatures and flourishes. There was a line about safety, a line about oversight. It all sounded careful and kind, the way a knife can sound careful in its sheath. June folded the paper in half and set it on the mantel. They sent the paper because paper walks where men shouldn't, she said. They'll send men next. Mason crossed to the little shelf by the bed and touched the picture of Eliza with his finger, once, as if counting the years. The glass was cold. The room waited on his back like a rider on a horse that knows the trail. We'll keep the heat up, he said mostly to the cradle. They worked small chores because small chores hold a house together. Boil the spoon, hang it by its handle. Stack kindling crosswise, twist rags into tighter rolls. June tied ear caps around Lily's small head and tucked the knot soft. Asa woke, frowned, then decided against crying. When the light thinned down to copper, Mason shouldered the door open to check the stack by the shed. The air bit clean and hard. Over the south flats, a column of black lifted straight into the evening like a finger laid against the sky. Not cook smoke. Fresh. Oily. Somewhere a barn was throwing its timbers. June stepped beside him and watched the line fatten. That'll be a message, she said. Read, Mason answered, and shut the door to keep the heat in and the fear out. Late light laid a thin blade along the timber line. Mason followed it to the edge of his place with an armload of split pine and the cold drilling his teeth. The river talked under ice. The wind rattled willow whips like cards in a gambler's hand. He heard the horse before he saw it, iron on crust, slow, exact, like a man measuring his steps against a rule. The rider came off the flats with his coat buttoned to the throat and gloves the color of cream, hat brim clean, boots unscarred. He sat a tall bay that looked barn-kept. Everything on him said order. "Mr. Hale," he called, stopping where the snow went from wind-scoured to deep. He didn't crowd the yard. Polite men never did. "Silas Voss. I represent Ashbriar Home for Foundlings." Mason set the wood down. He did not step closer. The house heat on his back, the river cold on his face, and between them, this man with town on him like a scent. "Word reached us," Voss went on, "that a basket was found by the powder. Twins. Such events create concern. The territory has provisions." He opened a leather folio and let the flap breathe without taking anything out of it. Proper placement, oversight, from people prepared for such charges. Mason didn't look at the folio. He looked at the horse's breath, at the neat braid in its tail, at the careful man who owned both. "You came a long way to say, 'Hand them over.'" Voss smiled in a way that managed not to touch his eyes. "I came a long way to keep the law gentle. Babies are delicate. Winter is not. You're alone out here, Mr. Hale. Your roof's tired, your wood's low. The kind choice is the lawful one." The folio's flap lifted a hair. Coins clicked. "Travel money out of respect. I dislike seeing men punished for not knowing the rules." The ice on the river popped. 2 quick knuckles. A jay scolded and went quiet. Mason could feel the twins' warmth on his shirt front, though they lay in the cradle inside. "Not yours to take," he said. Voss shifted his reins from one hand to the other. "They're not yours to keep?" Mason let that sit. He could sense the small movements in the trees beyond the man, a thin twitch of brush, a boy-sized breath being held. He didn't turn his head to it. "I won't argue the printed part," Voss said, tone as mild as milk. "But paper stands for people. Real families, good ones. You give me those babes, and by next week they'll have a fire at their feet. and a woman who knows a night's rocking from a day's errands. You keep them, and we begin to add up your deficits. No wet nurse, no doctor close, no wife. That ledger fills fast. Ledger's already full, Mason said, paid in things that didn't make your lists. Grief, Voss said softly, and for a heartbeat the word sat there between them like another person. Grief argues loud, but it doesn't plan well. Mason took one step. The snow groaned. He kept his hands where Voss could see them. I plan to keep them warm and breathing. That's my plan. The territory plans to collect what belongs to it. Voss tapped the folio. I'll return in a day with a writ and a marshal if I must. I'd rather we didn't sour the air. Something like pity touched his voice and was gone. The wind combed his coat and smoothed it back down again. He glanced past Mason as if the house itself might answer. Mason shook his head. Door stays shut to you. Voss's smile dropped the pretense of friendliness and kept the shape of manners. You'll make this hurt more than it has to, he said, and for the first time a wire showed under the velvet. Men get stubborn out here. Snow teaches the wrong lessons. Don't learn the hard one, Mr. Hale. Mason said nothing. He didn't move aside. The river cracked once more, longer this time, like a knifed seam giving way. They both listened to it. Voss gathered his reins. Tomorrow, he said. Early. He tipped his hat the width of a finger, turned the bay with his knee, and walked it off the driftline with the same tidy care he'd ridden in on. Mason watched him diminish to a dark pin among the cottonwoods, and then to only the sound of iron ticking over ice. He stood there until the cold found its way through his coat. Only then did he hook the wood into his arms, carry it inside, and lay a bar across his door that hadn't been raised since the spring floods. June came back near dark with a chemist's bottle warm in her pocket. She read his face without asking. Paperman came. Paperman came. She set the bottle by the stove and took her scarf off slow. They'll come with a badge to read it for him. We'll be ready, Mason said. Across town, the telegraph key at the copper spur chattered its insect talk. The clerk wiped a sleeve across his nose, copied the clicks to a line, and sent off the answer with a thumb and 2 fingers. Proceed quietly. The wind shouldered the cabin once, and then, like it had been told a secret, went soft around the eaves. Night broke, and the cold pressed its weight on the roof. Mason lit the lantern and went for the trap door by the stove. The iron ring lifted with a bark of frost, and a breath of earth rose. Old potatoes, damp stone, the memory of a hard year. He set the lantern on the steps and went down with a hammer, a saw, and a jaw set for work. The cellar was small, walled with river rock. His father had wrestled out of the powder back in '53 when a blizzard taught the Hales the shape of hunger. The floor was frozen clay with a crust of rime. He measured the damp with his palm, then set to bracing the joists. Pine slats, crosspieces, a frame for a cot. He worked fast, boards speaking under the nails, breath smoking in the lamplight. Every strike steadied him. Every spark of iron on iron said, live. June came with a bundle under her arm and set it on the kitchen table. More flannel, a jar of honey, a bottle Reverend Harlan could spare if he didn't know the label was missing. She tested Lily's forehead with 2 fingers and nodded once. Still warm, not burning. We'll sweat the edge off it. Cellar's dry, Mason said, loading a stack of blankets down the steps. Not warm enough yet. She fetched flat stones from the fire ring, wrapped them damp in cloth and handed them down. Set those by the cot. Steam beats cold when you trap it. Boots thumped on the porch. Orrin Cade ducked through the door with a grin like a nick in a blade and 2 lengths of strap iron under his arm. Brought you hinge and hasp. Thought your door might want a say in who comes calling. He laid iron on the stove, let it warm so it would take bend, then hammered careful on the back step. His strokes were slow and sweet, a blacksmith's lullaby. Reverend Harlan arrived behind him with his collar turned up and a box under his coat. "Camphor, laudanum if the screaming turns mean, and cough syrup if you pretend not to know who brewed it." He winked once. The room smiled without moving. Ayanna slipped in on the draft, small, quiet, snow glittering in her hair like ground glass. She didn't waste words. She washed her hands in water so hot, steam jumped, shook them dry, and went straight to the cradle. She bent near enough to feel breath with her cheek, eyes half closed, listening. "Girl fights heat," she said. "Boy fights noise. Good. Give both a job, and they will stay." She had Mason fold a blanket the long way and showed him how to tap the cradle rail with 2 fingers, steady, heartbeat pace. Not music, road rhythm. Horses know it, babies know it. June mixed powder and warm water, thinned with a thumb of honey, tested, handed off. Mason fed Lily in the cellar by lamplight, the little mouth working with fierce purpose. Ayanna rubbed the girl's back with a light circle and hummed something older than English. The fever's color lifted a shade, sweat beaded at the hairline. Lily sighed, the sound of a small gate swinging, miniature victory, the kind that keeps a man upright. Above, Orrin set the new hasp with screws he'd filed sharp. The bar across the door settled into its brackets with a final grown-up sound. He stamped snow from his boots and peered down the hole. "You'll need straw for the floor. Keep the damp off. I'll drag a bale from my shed and cuss about it later." "Put it on my tab," June said. "You don't have a tab with me," Orrin said mildly, and went to fetch it anyway. They worked without wasted talk. Coffee turned from black to hot to fresh. The lantern burned a measured hour. Ayanna traded Mason places and took Asa, laid him on her forearm, face down, and patted a rhythm that matched the cradle, left, right, left. The boy gave up the fight and let the world hold him. The house, pinched thin for days, grew a size. Mason carried a last load. Shirts, the little bottle of camphor, the picture of Eliza in its cracked frame, to set on a shelf cut from an old crate. He paused with the picture in his hands, thumb at the edge of the glass. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fire upstairs spoke enough. They climbed out of the cellar one by one. June tucked in the twins. Reverend corked his bottle and slipped his hat back on like a man leaving a gamble in better shape than he entered. Ayanna tied the ear caps neat and snug, then pressed her palm once to Mason's chest, over the pocket where the folded note rode. "Keep this warm," she said. Whether she meant his heart or the paper, even she might not have known. Orrin shouldered the door and tested the bar. "Solid," he said. "Makes a noise if asked to do otherwise." The storm had its say around the eaves. The night clenched. The house pushed back. They began the small walking. Hall to stove, stove to bed, bed to cradle, because that is how a siege is lived through. When the clock on the shelf coughed up 10 slow clacks, Lily's heat had fallen to a number that didn't scare Ayanna's eyes. Asa slept with his mouth open, a stubborn little man dreaming of his next argument. June exhaled the breath she'd been borrowing all day. "Good," she said. She let the word stand on its own feet. Orrin went to fetch his straw. Mason and June stepped to the porch to see him off. The air bit clean. Snow stood to the rails. The night was the kind that made sound travel oddly far, and that is why they heard it. The soft, empty whisper of a rope end kissing wood. June's goat should have been tied to the lee side of the shed, Bell stuffed with rags so it wouldn't tattle to coyotes. The rope lay where it had been, coiled, hardening into a frozen question. No fray, no worry, just a neat, straight cut, ends square as a ledger page. Mason lifted the rope end. Fibers shone in the moonwash, like a brush, just trimmed. "They were close," June said, voice flat. Close enough to touch the knot, Mason answered. The yard looked back at them with its blank white face. Somewhere, a boy's breath smoked behind a woodpile. Somewhere, a careful man considered which door to knock next. The bell in the goat's rag-stuffed mouth would never tell them a thing. Mason set the rope on the sill like a piece of evidence and shut the door soft. Inside, the cradle creaked once and went still, and the house listened to its own heart. By noon, the wind had planed Main Street down to bone. The copper spur wore frost on its windows like cataracts, and men hunched over glasses that didn't steam. The telegraph key ticked like a bug in a jar. Folks spoke in the low voice men use when they want to be heard, only by the man leaning closest. "Ash Briar's got the board behind it," the barkeep said, polishing a glass that would never be cleaned. "You tangle with a stamp that read, you wind up gut shot by paper." Mason stood just inside the door long enough for the room to feel him. Faces lifted, weighed him, slid away. He bought coffee that tasted of burned rope and carried it out untouched. Snow found him in the street and settled on his coat like warnings. He walked the boardwalk to the sheriff's office and paused because pausing was the same as knocking here. Sheriff Brody was old barn timber and tobacco stains. He sat with his boots on the desk and a blanket over his knees, reading a week-old Helena paper like it might tell him tomorrow's weather. He didn't look up when Mason stepped in. "They sent a writ," Mason said. "They will," Brody answered. "They got drawers of 'em." "You going to read it for them?" "Depends who they bring to hear it." Brody let the paper sag to his chest. His eyes were tired. "I got one deputy with a bad knee and 2 jail cells that breathe in a north wind. I don't arrest the weather." "They lit a barn last night," Mason said. "June's goat rope was cut clean. Might be worth you arresting something." Brody wiped his lip with a thumb. "If I could cuff fear, I'd be king of this valley." He nodded at the door. "They ain't coming to my office first. They'll go where the babies breathe. You know that? Then come to my door before they do." "I'm old, Hale," Brody said. "My badge is tin, their ink's iron." He set his feet on the floor. "But I ain't blind. I'll walk that way by afternoon." Mason left him to his paper and his blanket. Outside, the street had no opinion. It only took footsteps and kept them. He crossed to Oren's and swapped a thank you for a bale of straw he didn't have the money for. Oren didn't count the cost out loud. "Put it on June's list," he said, and winked like that made it funny. By dusk, the sky turned to pewter and the air to glass. A bell clanged wrong downriver, too fast and too scared, and black smoke lifted over Snyder's south field. Hay barn, oil in the flame by the color of it. Men ran without running shoes, hats yanked low, mouths set. No one looked at Mason. No one asked who said it. A deputy stood in the road with his hands in his pockets and watched the sparks pick the wind like burrs. Mason went home the long way. The river talked to itself. The cabin met him warm and tired. Lily slept with her fist against her cheek. Asa frowned at the ceiling as if building a case. June had the kettle at a lively simmer and the spoon already boiling. "You see it?" she asked without turning. "I saw it. Message written in fire reads in the dark," she said. "Cheaper than ink." He set the straw down and went for the door to drag in more wood. When he stepped onto the porch, his boot found something that didn't belong, char rubbed into rough pine. 4 words pressed hard with a burned stick until the letters sank. "Not yours, rancher." He stood over it, felt the small rise of the grain under his heel, the way a man feels a snake before he sees it. He didn't scrape it off. He let it sit there and took the wood inside. After supper, the wind lost interest and the night went clear. Stars laid out like salt on black iron. The house breathed. The twins breathed. June breathed. Mason stepped to the window and parted the curtain a finger's width. On the rise beyond the lower fence, 3 riders stood their horses side on to the moon. No talk, no fire, just legs long as winter and heads cocked to listen. One horse tossed and settled. A match flared cupped in a palm and died before the smoke could tattletale. "Don't open," June said behind him, already lifting the Winchester from where she kept it tucked behind the stove like a broom. "Let 'em look till their eyes water." "They're measuring," Mason said, "so measure back." She nudged the curtain closed with the barrel and set the rifle down without noise. "We keep the heat up. We keep the house small. We let the cold work for us." He checked the bar across the door. Orrin's new iron lay in the hasp, squared and true. He ran a hand along the wood like a man reading Braille. In the cradle, Lily wheezed once, a thin reed sound, and settled when June's palm found her belly and pressed a rhythm. Ayanna's stones, wrapped in damp cloth, breathed a faint steam where they sat in a pan by the hearth. Sheriff Brody came late, coat white at the shoulders, hat in his hands, eyes turned to the line of the hill like a man who'd forgotten a song and couldn't quite catch it. He read the words on the porch, nodded once, and scuffed them with his heel until the grain showed through. "You don't win against smoke and whisper," he said to the door, not loud enough to wake anybody. "You wait till men have to do their talking where the sun can see their mouths." He left without knocking. On the rise, the riders faded, one by one, like bad thoughts. You don't quite believe in daylight. The house ticked as it cooled and warmed, cooled and warmed. Mason drew a chair to the cradle and sat with his hands open to the fire. He listened to the small sounds: breath, cloth, kettle, wood. He thought about the writ that would come in the morning, folded like a compliment, about ink that claimed what blood had not, and about the part of a man that has to choose the size of the hurt he can stand. "Easy," he told the dark. "We'll be here." Before dawn, the house breathed shallow, and the cold crept under the door like a thief. Mason put coffee to mutter on the stove and set his hands on the table map. Nothing but memory and fence lines. But a man draws his country where he's bled. June tied her hair back with twine, rolled tin pans in wire, and nodded to the back door. Ayanna waited with a bundle of stones in a wet towel, steam lifting like smoke from a small fire. "We walk the ditch," Ayanna said. "Ice won't keep prints if you learn to step light." "Rattles?" June asked. "String 'em by the woodpile and the pig pen. Low. Wind sings high. Men sing low." They split without chatter. Mason took the mounded irrigation ditch that ran crooked behind the shed. The ice glazed black and thin in places. He tested with the flat of his boot, found the strong seam, and made a path a horse couldn't read. June hung the tins with a butcher's calm, 2 nails, 1 knot, a whisper of wire. Ayanna raked the yard with a willow broom to turn tracks to drift. Day came sickly, a pewter sheet with a tear in it. The river talked under its lid. A far hawk turned lazy circles and decided against getting involved. Mason finished the ditch work and brought the stones to the cellar. Lily slept damp at the hairline. Asa chewed air like a pup. Mason tapped the cradle rail with 2 fingers. Road rhythm, same as before. He felt the house take that beat like a heart it wanted. "Eat," June said, handing him bread and cold rabbit. He ate, standing up, listening to wire sing against tin in the wind, high when the gusts had their way, low when something heavier worried the line. Low came from the woodpile just after noon. 1 clink, a pause, a second shorter. June lifted her eyes. Mason thumbed back the hammer and let it down again. "Let 'em see what we want 'em to see," she breathed. Mason went to the door, opened it 6 inches, and let the heat roll out like bait. He stepped onto the porch with his shoulders easy and his hands empty. The yard lay white and innocent, the broom marks soft as brush strokes. Beyond the woodpile, a cap flickered, brown, sweat-stained, wrong color for a gentleman. The cap sank. A knee took its place. Then a boy's face lifted out of the world, red from cold and running. Ephraim Pike saw Mason and tried to become snow. The wires sang twice, and the tins chattered. He bolted for the fence line and missed his step, where the drift broke across the ditch like whipped cream over a black pan. He went down hard, both hands, pencil skidding, hat rolling toward the willow broom. Mason didn't draw. He hit the yard in 3 strides, slid a boot across the ice, and reached the boy as Ephraim fought the ditch like a fish in a live well. Mason caught him by the coat collar, hauled him out, and set him on his feet. "Easy," he said. "I ain't—" Ephraim started, then bit it off because his teeth were trying to chatter their way out of his head. Mason pulled a clean rag from his pocket and pressed it to the boy's scraped palm. "Hold it," he said, then bent to pick up the hat and shake the snow from it. He set it back on the head it belonged to. The boy's eyes were gray and quick and trapped. "You can run," Mason said, "or you can listen for a minute. Doesn't change what I do next." Ephraim looked past Mason to the door where the heat showed, and the smell of coffee walked out like welcome. He looked to the trees where something older than him watched with neat boots and patient eyes. He swallowed. "They pay me to write who goes where," he muttered. "That's all." "Who's they today?" The boy's mouth slanted. "Man with a soft voice and clean gloves." "Thought so." Mason took the pencil from the snow, stuck it behind Ephraim's ear, and loosened his fingers until the knuckles quit being white. "Go home." "I ain't got one." "Then go anywhere that ain't here." Ephraim wavered, weight shifting heel to toe like a colt thinking whether to stand or kick. He pulled the rag tight around his hand, gave Mason a look that might one day grow into an apology, and cut sideways along the fence where the wind would erase his name. June had the rifle cradled when Mason came back in. "You let him go?" she said. "Not question. Fact." "Boy's not the fight," Mason said. "The fight pays him," she answered. But she let the rifle down and started the kettle again. They spent the rest of the light making the house small. Food close, water hot, stones hot. Diapers boiled and hung where the steam could talk to their fibers. The tins quivered now and then, wind mostly, sometimes not. Toward evening, a shape set itself on the horizon by the cottonwoods telegraph, tall as a nail driven into a board. At the copper spur, the key chattered, and the clerk wiped his nose and rattled off the clicks, eyes going wide as if code could bite. The message from Helena said what messages from big places always say: comply, expedite, keep your hands clean. The reply from Ash Breer came on its heels. Proceed quietly had already been sent. This one had more muscle in it. Marshal en route, carriage waiting at Dead Colt. Silas Voss read both, turned the paper to the lamplight, and smiled the way a man smiles at a hand he likes before the cards are turned. He slipped on his gloves one finger at a time and went out into the falling dark, where careful men do their best work. The storm rode in fast, a fist of snow smacking the valley open. Mason watched it come from the window, sky going gunmetal, trees bowing at the waist. The air bit through the seams of the house, turning every board into a complaint. June shuttered the windows and laid towels in the cracks. Ayanna stoked the fire, her face red in the heat, hands moving steady and sure. Lily's cough was rough as a saw. Asa wouldn't take milk, just chewed his fist and stared at the ceiling, eyes wide as old coins. Mason wrapped them in fresh flannel, set the hot stones close, and counted their breaths against the winds. Every cry from the cradle landed like a stone in his chest. June hung 2 rabbits by the back door, caught at dawn with a sure shot and patience that outlasted the cold. She skinned and stewed them, slow, ladled broth into tin cups for Mason and the children. Her hands shook, but her eyes stayed clear. Ayanna brewed tea with willow bark for the fever and sat with Lily, rocking her with a touch so light it barely left a mark. Outside, the world shrank to what the lamplight could reach. The tins strung along the fence rattled now and then, sometimes by the wind, sometimes by something more. Each sound made Mason's back stiffen. He checked the rifle, kept it close, but what he feared most was what paper and whispers could do. They ran out of cough syrup just after dusk. June found the empty bottle and turned it over slow, the way a gambler checks the last card and finds no miracle. "We need more," she said, her voice flat. "Stores closed, roads gone," Mason answered. "We'll lose her if the fever takes another jump." Ayanna said nothing, only met Mason's eyes and nodded once, the nod of someone who's lost too many to let hope go cheap. "I'll go," Mason said, already lacing his boots, pulling on the oilskin coat, tucking the revolver in the waistband. "You keep the fire up, keep their cheeks warm." June reached for his arm, gripped it once, then let go. "Don't do anything stupid." "Stupid's what happens when you're too late. I won't be." He stepped into the blizzard. The cold took his breath, snow in the mouth, wind dragging at his legs like dead weight. The world shrank to the oval of his lantern and the path he'd walked 1,000 times, now gone, erased by drift. He moved by memory and prayer, boots sinking, shoulders hunched, the night hungry for every bit of his heat. Halfway to town he heard it, hooves crunching in the snow, faint at first, then closer, then gone. He pressed against a cottonwood, lantern dimmed, heart loud in his ears. Shadows slipped past, 3 riders, shapes swaddled in coats too fine for this storm, moving like men with a map and an errand. Mason watched them ride on toward his cabin and felt fear boil into something sharper. He hurried. The town's edge came sudden, copper spurs windows yellow with light, but most doors shut tight. Mason banged on June's store until she opened up, eyes wide, hair wild from sleep. "Cough syrup, willow bark, whatever's left," he said. She didn't ask questions. She loaded a sack, pressed a vial into his palm. "For Lily, tell her the price is a story when she's old enough to trade." He ran the alleyways, ducked under the eaves when the wind howled. He passed the telegraph office, light still burning, saw the operator slumped over the key, snoring or dead. On the street's edge, a black carriage waited, oil lamps, hooded, curtains drawn tight. The driver didn't look up. When he circled homeward, the fear that chased him was bigger than the cold. He watched for riders, kept to the trees, eyes raw from snow and worry. By the time he saw the first glow of his cabin, the storm had stripped him down to a shiver and a will. The house stood, battered but unbroken. Tins rattled in the wind, but no hoofprints scored the snow. He stepped inside, blinked at the warmth, and let June take the sack. Ayanna spooned the syrup to Lily, who swallowed, whined, then fell to sleep with a shudder. He sat by the fire, boots smoking, breath loud, watching the children breathe and the storm rage. June pressed a dry cup of coffee into his hand. He took it and didn't let go. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Mason answered, voice rough as gravel. Outside, 3 riders turned their horses at the edge of the woods, watched the lamplight, then slipped away into the dark. Inside, the fire burned steady. The children slept, and Mason kept watch, knowing the worst storm was still to come. By morning, the blizzard had wrung the world white and mean. Mason's legs ached from the run to town. His eyes burned with the ache of night half slept. The fire was only a red eye in the stove, but the house still stood. Wood creaking, stones sweating, children breathing. Outside, the storm had left everything blank and blameless, except for a set of horse tracks winding back toward the main road. 3 riders gone, not forgotten. June put a kettle on and set her back to the door, eyes rimmed red but clear. Lily's fever broke with the dawn, leaving her limp as a sock, but breathing. Asa watched the window, fist in his mouth, chewing the world. Ayanna pressed a palm to Lily's head, nodded approval. "She'll stay," she said, as if it were a promise she could keep with her own hands. A knock, two sharp, one slow, landed on the door like an old debt. Mason lifted the rifle and let the barrel rest against his leg. Silent. It was Orrin, cheeks split from the cold, carrying a jug of kerosene and a folded piece of paper. "Rode into town before first light," Orrin said, voice brittle. "Found this posted on the copper spur. Silas Voss had the marshal write it proper." He handed Mason the paper, heavy, official, edges pinked by the notary's shears. A blood-red seal, fresh wax, the words writ in a clerk's careful hand. "By order of the territorial court, the wards known as Lily and Asa are to be delivered to the custody of Ashbriar Home. For foundlings, immediately, delay will be taken as defiance. Signed, Judge L. Harrison, Notary Jenks, Marshal Hume." Mason read it twice, once with his eyes and again with his bones. The threat was in the spacing, not the words. Orrin ran a finger along the edge of the paper. "Word is, Voss has a carriage waiting out at Dead Colt Wash. Hired hands. Big names. They say Ashbriar doesn't keep babies long. They sell 'em. Families back east, mining camps, wherever pays." June looked at the floor, mouth set. "That's not law, that's theft," Orrin shrugged. "Law's just what paper says it is until someone tears it up." Ayanna's eyes flashed, quick as a knife in a sheath. She stuffed herbs into a cloth, twisted it, tied it with her teeth. "You keep babies moving, hide in the old cellar. I'll stay above." Mason gripped Orrin's shoulder. "No words, just wait." "You sure?" he asked Ayanna, quiet. She nodded, hair falling over one eye. "I make fire and noise. They come for me, not you." June handed Mason a flask of camphor and a length of linen. "Dead Colt Wash is only safe if you don't walk into the open. There's a trail behind the brickyard. Ephraim knows it. Find him if you can. He owes you more than a secret." Mason checked the rifle, wrapped Lily and Asa in the thickest flannel he owned, and loaded them into the basket that had brought them here. He nodded to Orrin, who slipped outside to watch the road. Before Mason could leave, Ephraim Pike stumbled through. The back door, cheeks flushed, a crumpled sheet clutched in his fist. "They're waiting," the boy panted. "Carriage at Dead Colt. This," he shoved the sheet at Mason, "is the route. Saw it on Voss's desk. I ain't with them no more." June pressed a biscuit into Ephraim's hand. He blinked, startled, then stuffed it in his mouth. Mason clapped his shoulder, bent low. "Thank you, son. You did right." The boy's eyes shone, fear, pride, both. "Don't let 'em take the babies," he said. "Don't let 'em win." June shouldered her rifle, eyes set. "We'll buy you time. But you run silent, Mason. Run like you got nothing to lose." Outside, the wind was low and sly. The snow had crusted hard, but every step left a mark. Mason carried the twins close, his heart a hammer, his hands sure, eyes sharp for any sign of riders, any flicker in the trees. Inside, Ayanna built up the fire, made the house look busy and small. Orrin slid along the fence line, shovel in hand, like any other day. June waited at the window, rifle hidden, pulse pounding, ready. In the distance, on the road to Dead Colt Wash, the carriage waited, a shadow with lamps dimmed, doors shut tight, secrets locked inside. And somewhere, Silas Voss and the marshal counted down, thinking the law would bring a man to heel. But the paper burned colder than the snow, and Mason Hale was already moving, children pressed to his chest, regret burning brighter than any badge or writ could threaten. Nightfall brought a hush that didn't soothe. Mason and the twins hid deep in the cellar. the world above a tapestry of creaks and stray noises. The lamplight burned small and close, shadows tall against dirt walls that sweated cold. Lily slept with her fist curled in his shirt. Asa pressed his cheek to Mason's chest, breathing slow, trusting as only babies can. June came down the steps, arms folded, eyes shadowed by the day's cost. She sat on the edge of an old crate, quiet for a long minute. The fire above popped, and Mason listened, bracing for the sound of boots, a voice demanding names, the law coming down hard. Instead, June broke the silence. "You ever wish you could take something back, Mason?" He didn't answer at first. His throat worked, words rough as stones. "Every day." He touched the cradle's smooth rail, thumb tracing the old chips. "My wife, Eliza." He let the name hang, the word pulling the hurt out from its burrow. "The night she went into labor, I was out. Cattle deal. Promised her it'd set us up for years. She said she could wait. I was sure of it. But the storm came in. I got caught crossing the ford. By the time I made it home, it was too late. Just a cradle, empty, and a bottle of oil she'd meant to use for the baby. I buried her at sunrise. Never forgave myself for not being there. Never will." June's hands knotted around her knees. "Regret's a mean animal, Mason. It bites you awake at night, then won't let go in the morning." He looked at the twins, their breaths sinking with his own. "If I had another chance," he said, voice trembling, "I wouldn't leave again, not for money, not for pride, not for anything." June reached out, touched Lily's tiny foot, her thumb rough but sure. "You got that chance now. These babies—" She nodded. "They don't need a hero, just someone who stays, someone who doesn't walk out the door." Mason's shoulders shook, but the tears didn't fall. He pressed his lips to Asa's brow, felt the heat, the need, the life so close to being lost, if not for a man willing to stand his ground. Above, the night split with a sharp whistle. June tensed, hand flying to the rifle. 3 riders circled the yard, horses' breath steaming in the moonlight, hooves muffled by new snow. Ayana's silhouette moved at the window, firelight gold on her hair. "Stay put," June said, voice low. "We hold fast, you keep them close." She climbed the steps, pausing only to look back once. "If you gotta run, Mason, run for them, not from yourself." He nodded, not trusting his voice. The cellar door closed soft. Mason rocked the cradle, mind lost in the ache of all the things he couldn't fix, but heart set on the 2 lives that still could be saved. Outside, boots crunched, voices blurred by wind. The sheriff's badge flashed in lantern light, old but shining. The law had come, but so had the ones who made their own laws. Mason clutched the twins tight, whispering into the dark, "I'm here. I'll stay." A new day waited, teeth bared. He would meet it with regret behind him and hope, hard-won, fragile, cradled in his arms. The morning bit like tin in the mouth. Mason slipped from the cellar just as the world turned gray. He wrapped Lily and Asa in thick flannel, tucked them close beneath his oilskin, and breathed in the cold until it sharpened his fear into focus. Above, June and Ayana moved quiet as cats, keeping the house noisy, wood chopped, kettle boiling, a song on June's lips that sounded like something from before the valley turned mean. Orrin was already out by the barn, eyes slitted against the wind, shovel slung casual. He met Mason's glance with a single nod. This was the hour. Mason took the back trail, skirting the fence line, boots soft in the crusted snow. Ephraim Pike waited behind the brickyard, hat pulled low, eyes darting every which way. "They're watching the main road," the boy whispered. "But there's an old channel runs straight to Dead Colt Bridge. Nobody checks it." "Good," Mason said, hoisting the basket. "You go back. Keep your head down. You did right." Ephraim hesitated, thumb hooked in his pocket, then handed over a coil of thin rope. "Ice is slick on the bridge." You'll want this." The boy's face was fierce with something like hope, something like shame. Mason squeezed his shoulder, then set off, the trail twisting through willows and frost-cracked grass following the powder's frozen edge. June watched from the cabin, eyes on the ridge, rifle at the ready. Ayanna tended the fire, built up smoke to keep the air thick and the house looking lived in. Orrin walked the roof with a length of iron, banging it every so often to sound like repairs, all of them holding the line in their own way. At the wash, the bridge waited, boards slick with rime, rails crusted white. On the far bank, a carriage black as a crow and twice as silent, doors closed, curtains drawn. A pair of hired men stood off to the side, hats pulled low, hands heavy at their belts. Silas Voss, in his neat coat, gloves buttoned tight, waited with the marshal, Hume, badge catching what little light the clouds let through. Mason took the first step onto the bridge. It moaned, old bones flexing in the wind. He cradled the twins close, feeling every plank shift, heart beating a hard rhythm. Voss raised a gloved hand. "Mr. Hale, this is the end of it. Hand over the children. The law's here. There's nothing left to argue." Mason didn't answer. He kept walking, slow, steady. The bridge creaked under his weight, ice shining like glass. Marshal Hume stepped forward, hand resting on his pistol. "You don't want trouble, son." "I already got trouble," Mason said. "Don't need yours." Voss's smile was thin as thread. "Think carefully. Defiance carries a price." Mason reached the center of the bridge, stopped. The wind cut straight through, carrying every word into the white hush. "Children ain't cargo," Mason said. "You want them, come take them." The first hired man stepped forward, boots sliding on the slick planks. Mason waited, breathing slow. As the man reached for him, Mason let the rope slip, looped it fast around the rail. In one sharp motion, he jerked it tight. The hired man's feet shot out, sending him sprawling onto the ice. The crack echoed, a jagged sound that made every head snap up. The ice beneath the bridge began to splinter, lines racing like lightning. Mason shifted, one boot balanced, heart hammering. Voss cursed, stepping back. "You fool! You'll kill us all!" "Or save who matters," Mason growled. The ice gave a low moan, then broke. The hired man slipped, legs dangling, grabbing for the rope. Mason didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man's wrist, hauled him back up, and shoved him to safety. The gesture wasn't lost on anyone. Even the marshal's eyes softened, just for a moment. Ephraim popped up on the near bank, wild with nerves. "Don't go with them, Mason. There's another carriage out by the willows. Ash Briar means to sell them off before sundown." Mason looked Voss in the eye. "Ends not yours to write. Not today." He turned, slung the twins to his chest, and backed away. No one followed. The ice groaned, but held. On the far side, the lawmen hesitated, as if remembering what the river could take and what it could never return. Ephraim stood at the edge, breathless. "I'm done working for them," he said, voice breaking. "Don't want no more part of it." "Go home, kid," Mason told him, voice rough. "Find somewhere worth staying." Mason didn't look back as he hurried toward the shadow of the trees. Behind him, Dead Colt Bridge stood empty, and for a long moment nothing moved but the river below, whispering its secrets to whoever cared to listen. The sun clawed its way above the ridge, gold and cold. Frost smoked off the roofs, catching the morning light in broken pieces. Sagebrush Crossing woke up careful, curtains twitching, boots slow on the boards. Every face hunting for the day's trouble before it found them first. The church bell called folks in with a hollow ring. Mason walked the twins down the street, bundled tight, June beside him with her jaw set. The town watched from behind glass and between cracks in the doors. Ayanna moved ahead, silent as shadow, laying her hands on old Mrs. Epps, then the Lindley boy with his cough. Then a stray dog shivering under the hitching rail. Orrin stood by the chapel steps, arms crossed, nodding at anyone brave enough to meet his gaze. Inside, Reverend Harlan read from a Bible battered as the valley itself, voice plain as river stones. He kept it short. "We are all, each one, keepers of the orphans and the left behind," he said. "Some folks think blood's the only thing that matters. I say love writes its own kin." Sheriff Brody sat in the back pew, badge pinned square, eyes steady on Mason. June held Lily. Mason rocked Asa. They made a picture that felt too still, like a painting before the glass cracks. The congregation divided along an invisible fault, half longing to help, half hungry for distance. Whispers moved like prairie fire. Some hands fumbled for hymnals, others for worry stones. But when the service ended, nobody moved. Outside, the cold bit sharper. Brody rose, straightened his old tin badge, and walked over slow. "I've read the writ, Mason. Paper says one thing. My gut says another." He nodded to June, touched Lily's tiny foot with a finger gnarled as a root. "Ash Briar's got heavy friends, but this is my town. If you stand here, I stand here." Orrin grunted, took up a spot beside Brody. "Iron's thicker than ink anyway." Ayanna smiled once, just with her eyes, then turned to the crowd. "Children remember who holds them when storms come." A hush rippled through the street. June turned to face the folks still lingering on the church steps, voice clear as creek water. "If you ever lost a child, or ever were one, you know what's at stake." Reverend Harlan handed Mason a worn hymnal, pressed it into his palm. "Sometimes you sing just to hear hope in your own voice." Footsteps echoed. Down the street, Silas Voss appeared. Marshall at his side, writ in hand, red seal bleeding through the paper. He walked slow, measuring every shadow, every pair of eyes. The town waited, air thin as glass. And with one soft click, Sheriff Brody fastened his badge. "Let's see whose law holds best," he said, voice carrying farther than he meant. Mason looked at the faces, fear and courage tangled together, old wounds and new lines. He squeezed June's hand, rocked Asa once more, and waited for the showdown every man in town had known was coming since the snow first fell. Snow still covered the street, powder turning to glare as the noon sun pressed down, making every shadow sharp as a knife. Main Street was lined with faces at the windows, men and women bunched at the edges, hands tight on their own hearts. Mason stood in the open, the twins bundled in his arms, June by his side, her grip steady, chin high. Sheriff Brody and Orrin flanked them, Ayanna's eyes always searching, the whole town watching what would break first, the law or a man's promise. Silas Voss stepped out, writ in hand, Marshall trailing close, black coat snapping like a judge's tongue. His voice cut through the cold. "Under order of Judge Harrison and the Territorial Board, the children known as Lily and Asa are to be surrendered to Ash Briar Home for foundlings. Defiance will not be tolerated. Hand them over now or stand as outlaws in your own town." Mason didn't move. He lowered the twins so everyone could see their faces, soft, pink, full of all the tomorrows no law could ever promise. June stepped forward, voice clear and unafraid. "You want them? Name the price. Here, in front of God and neighbors. Tell us what a child's worth, Silas." Voss's jaw tightened. "That's not the question before us." "Isn't it?" June fired back. "Ash Briar's been buying and selling for years. Tell us the sum. Look the twins in the eye and say it plain." A hush thickened. The marshal's hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw. Orrin planted his boots and set his hammer down at his feet. At the edge of the street, Ephraim Pike emerged, cap in hand, trembling but standing tall. "Saw the ledger, Silas. Saw the names. Families paid for children never seen again. Wagons wait at dead colt. You don't want justice, you want coin. A ripple moved through the crowd. June stepped up, pulling from her coat a battered notebook. Pages crammed with Ashbrier's scribbled accounts, addresses, sums. Here's your record. Every debt, every dirty deal. You want the law. Let's lay out the truth. The crowd shifted, voices rising, fear giving way to something stronger, angrier. Voss tried to retreat, but Brody's hand clamped on his shoulder. Drop the writ, Silas. This town's not for sale. The marshal hesitated. The wind rattled the sign above the copper spur. Mason looked at the babies, then the sky. We've paid enough, Marshal. You want blood, it'll have to be ours too. A shot rang out, quick, sharp, harmless, June's rifle snapping the lock off Voss's pistol as he fumbled for it, the weapon clattering to the snow. Let that be enough, she said, breath visible in the cold. The crowd surged forward, men and women closing ranks. For the first time, Silas Voss's voice trembled. You'll regret this. Mason answered, voice steady as winter. We already have. But not for this. The Ashbrier carriage, waiting at the edge of town, turned and fled, wheels spinning as snow began, at last, to melt, dripping from the eaves and trickling down the street. Sheriff Brody drew his coat tight and let out a sigh that sounded like thanks. No more law than the one we keep together, he said. The sun rode higher, noon passing, the threat gone. Main Street left with nothing but its own reflection and the promise that, for once, nobody would have to run. By dusk, Sagebrush Crossing was quiet in a way only a town that's seen too much can be. The last scraps of sunlight caught on melting icicles, painting gold lines across the rutted street. Doors cracked open, not with fear, but with the slow relief of danger past. Ayanna carried a bundle of warm stones to the Hale cabin. June trailed a laugh behind her for the first time in weeks, and Orrin hammered the last brace into Mason's door, hands sure, face tired but easy. Inside, the heat was gentle, fire flickering low. Mason set Lily and Asa down in the old wooden cradle, their breaths soft and even, faces pink with honest sleep. June adjusted the blanket at their feet, thumb brushing Asa's brow, her movements quiet and careful, as if afraid to wake hope itself. Ayanna placed the hot stones at the foot of the cradle and pressed her palm to Lily's back, murmuring words from her mother's tongue that made even the fire hush. Orrin stood by the door, cap in hand. Storms broke, he said. That means roads'll open by morning, but I reckon we keep 'em shut a little longer, at least to trouble. Sheriff Brody left his badge on a nail above the hearth, then took a chair, hat in his lap, boots stretched toward the warmth. Reverend Harlan came, with coffee strong enough to stand a spoon, and a letter ready for Helena, thick with witness and truth. Enough, maybe, to close Ashbrier for good. Ephraim Pike crept in as shadows lengthened, hat pressed flat, holding out a small jackknife Mason had loaned him at Dead Colt Bridge. I didn't lose it, the boy said, almost proud. Didn't run, neither. Mason took the knife, pressed Ephraim's shoulder, and let the moment stand. He moved to the table, poured a second cup of coffee, and placed it on the empty chair beside him. The chair that still smelled of Eliza, the chair that meant family kept for whoever came home. June caught his eye, a question unspoken. Mason nodded, voice a hush lower than the fire. I'm not going anywhere. The cradle creaked. Lily let out a sigh, Asa a little snore, and outside, the wind had lost its teeth, just a soft brush against the cabin, almost like a lullaby. Folks lingered, drinking coffee, trading small stories, making plans that sounded suspiciously like hope. The badge glinted above the fire, a promise that law could bend toward mercy. No grand speeches, no victory parades, just warmth earned hard, hearts bruised but beating, And in the hush after the storm, Mason looked at the babies, the friends gathered, the cabin filled with something whole. If regret lived here, it had finally made peace with forgiveness. Outside, the last snow slipped from the roof. Horses in the yard nickered for hay. Somewhere, a new wind started up, gentle and sure, promising that winter this time had lost. If this story hit you right in the heart, drop a simple 1 down below or just type "still here." Sometimes that's all it takes. Don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West tales that'll make you pause, remember, and maybe see yourself in every sunset. Stick around, there's always another story waiting down the road.